Are you curious about Gestalt language processing? You are not alone. Join me, Corinne Smoose, and Speech Therapy PD for our podcast, The Gestalt Get Together. Our episodes try to balance the enthusiasm and excitement about GLP and its associated intervention ideas, as well as a healthy dose of skepticism about how to understand and integrate this paradigm shift into your career and the field at large. We hope that you can get together with us to learn more about Gestalts.
Welcome to Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs, presented by SpeechTherapyPD.com. This podcast is designed for the adult medical speech-language pathologist. Most of our audience members work in settings such as acute care hospitals, private practice, outpatient hospital clinics, and inpatient rehabilitation hospitals. Each episode has an accompanying audio course on SpeechTherapyPD.com and is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. The content of this course is based on the research and experience of the presenters. The listener is responsible for researching to determine if the information and skills taught are appropriate for their clients, students, or patients. SpeechTherapyPD.com does not necessarily endorse, recommend, or favor the information shared, nor any of the claims, opinions, statements, offers, or services made by the presenter. Hello, and welcome everyone. My name is Renee Garrett, and I am your SpeechTherapyPD.com podcast host for Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs. Before we get started, we have a few items to alert you to. Each episode is 60 minutes and will be offered for 0.1 ASHA CEU. Here are the financial and non-financial disclosures. The financial disclosure for Bob McKinney is that he receives royalties for his book, Here's How to Do Accent Modification. He is employed by the Sweetwater Union High School District and San Diego State University. He receives an honorarium from SpeechTherapyPD.com for his appearance on this podcast. His non-financial disclosure is that he is on the board of directors of the California Speech Language Hearing Association, serving as president, and the Corporate Speech Pathology Network, or CORSPAN. My financial disclosure is that I'm a paid employee of a private consulting firm in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And as the host of Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs, and other webinars on SpeechTherapyPD.com, I do receive financial compensation. I'm also an adjunct instructor for both James Madison University and Old Dominion University. My non-financial disclosure is that I'm the secretary for the Communication Disorders Foundation of Virginia. Now, without further ado, we welcome our guest, Robert Bob McKinney, MA, CCC-SLP, who is the author of Here's How to Do Accent Modification, published by Plural Publishing in 2019. He holds MAs in Communicative Disorders, International Relations, and Education. Bob speaks 6 languages, has lived in 6 countries, and has worked with clients from over 80 nations. He had a 26-year career in ESL instruction, including working as a teacher trainer at UCSD's English Language Institute. He currently works with predominantly bilingual students as the lead SLP at the Sweetwater Union High School District. At San Diego State University, he teaches phonetics and supervises graduate students in the Accent and Communication Training Program. He is the president of the California Speech Language Hearing Association and the Corporate Speech Pathology Network, or CORSPAN, co-president. Welcome, Bob. Good to see you, and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Renee. It's great to be here.
So we have a lot to talk about.
Yes.
Yeah, so let's just kind of jump right in. I'm reading through I saw the 6 language in 6 countries, and I completely forgot about that part of our interaction. What 6 languages, if you don't mind sharing?
Well, of course, English, and that's my L1. And then I also speak German, and then Russian, Hungarian, Spanish, and Portuguese. So I hope that adds up to 6, but those are the ones that I speak.
It seems like 6. I became a speech pathologist, so I didn't have to do so much math.
Okay, exactly. It's not a strong suit for me, but I'm at 6 there. And I've lived in all those, or in countries where those languages are spoken. And I think that immersion is always very helpful. And just for everyone out there listening, just speaking another language is such a great experience and never too late. Spanish, for example, I learned in my 30s and I use it all the time professionally. It's one of the main things I do in my job, really.
Oh, that's cool. I spent a lot of time doing Spanish in high school and college, and I would love to say that I could hold a conversation. And Faye Murray would tell you that probably not so much.
Yeah. And
I
everyone
try.
can just adjust, I think, ethically, because I think there's a lot you can do, even if you're just starting out with a language and you speak a little bit of high school Spanish, really just interacting with parents at an IEP meeting, or if you're in a hospital setting, really a little bit of translation for the family just goes a long way.
Yeah, and I find myself I can understand and respond in my head, or understand and comprehend in my head, but being able to conversationally come back with something is the hard part, not the part we necessarily learn in our schooling and our education programs.
That's it. And I think, I was thinking back about it too, just recently, how when I was young, I actually remember a phase where I didn't see the value of languages and really didn't think, why would anyone do this? And then it's so funny because it's such a big part of my life and has been really since my adult years, really. But as a teenager, I didn't see the point in it. But now it's just it's been such an amazing part of my life. And now and I am married to a non-native SLP who's from Hungary with a non-native accent. And I have a bilingual son now. He's 15 and a half, and he's balanced in his 2 languages and learning. He's actually had some experiences with 2 others.
Oh, wow, that's really cool. So let's kind of jump into accents then,
Yeah.
because we touched on this as well. So, how do we define what accents are and why people have them?
Well, I like to think of it as really looking at it with really having 2 definitions, because I think that clarifies a few things, because that word accent's used in some major ways. But there's an example of really the broad definition, which would be just the features of your speech that tell where you are or who you are regionally or socially. And that's the broad definition, because if you look at that definition, which everyone could really agree with, then everyone has an accent, everyone. But if you go to the narrow definition, it's really more about the features of speech that make you sound like a native speaker or a mainstream dialect speaker of a language. So that one is more narrow. And that's the one that's actually out there in the real world all the time. That's the one that's 99% of the time in use, because people will say, oh, he has an accent, doesn't have an accent, to all of those things, right? Which we know from the broad definition is not true, because everyone has an accent. But I think it really is almost, if you just go with the broad definition, I think you're missing out that people are using that term all the time, because it's so, accents are noticeable. They're very noticeable. We know that infants can hear it. You can hear it in 30 milliseconds of speech. So we're just primed for this. When you hear someone, you're noticing something about where they're from socially or regionally, and it's creating these in groups and out groups automatically right away. You're saying this person is kind of like me or in my group, or that person is not in my group, and this shifts where the groups are, the boundaries of the groups, but it's creating in groups and out groups all the time.
Yeah, and that's kind of cool because when thinking about, like English as your L1, having a heritage language or even a second language, or, in your case, many languages, it kind of, I think we often miss out, as English being our first language, that there are so many dialectal variations for
Yeah.
us. But I think sometimes we forget there's so many dialectal variations for other heritage languages. Like, I'll say Spanish for sure, because Cuban Spanish is different from Spain Spanish, is different from Puerto Rican Spanish. And I think that's a
Oh,
really
yeah, absolutely.
excellent point to make too, because especially with, for me, I treat adults and I see adults. And so that's always my focus. But I think when we're thinking about language learning or language impaired kids, that speaks to, like, the course across the lifespan for that as
Yeah,
well.
and that lifespan question is interesting, because I think that's one of the real defining features of native and non-native accents is what we call critical or sensitive period, which people have been aware of really since the dawn of mankind. I mean, it's really something that people have been aware of, this idea that children are going to be immersed in a new language and they're going to end up sounding indistinguishable from people who were born into that linguistic environment. But if you start learning a language, no matter what language it is or who you are or how or any of your linguistic abilities, underlying linguistic abilities, if you learn a language as an adult, you'll sound different. That's the way that it works. There are extremely few exceptions to that. I mean, people can pass a little bit sometimes, but generally, once you're an adult, you're always going to sound a little bit different. So we know that's just normal and natural. That's how accents work.
Well, it kind of takes me to when I was at speech school and I was, my graduate program, actually it might have been even undergrad. I think we did ASL in both, which is the complete and distinct language of us. And again, with dialectal variations. And it was interesting because I had been immersed in Spanish for quite a long time and still am not, God, I wouldn't consider myself bilingual by any stretch. But what was funny is when I would see someone sign in class, when we were at the point where our teacher was trying to do it, or she was doing an immersion approach where, she would sign to us and we had to interpret. I would hear it in my head in Spanish.
Oh, okay.
Which was, I think I was in my 30s and it was the weirdest thing to me. So I was like, wait, what is happening?
Yeah, and when you're learning languages, sometimes you'll dream in those languages and all that. But it's just interesting because since that's the way that it works, but in a sense, people don't really understand that because most of society expects people to study a language long enough to where they sound exactly like a native speaker. And one way you can see this is if you watch movies, it's a pretty common plot point in a lot of movies where someone actually turns out to have learned it is from another country and they're either a spy or they're something, or they were actually born in Germany or whatever it was. And it comes up all the time and it's completely unrealistic. It basically never ever happens. And to me, it's almost like that if every 10th movie you saw, the character could suddenly start flying and no one asked any questions about it, but that's the way it's in many movies. And really, when I was studying this, I thought, well, I wonder if I go to the world of espionage or the world of acting to really see if people have ever been able to get to that level where they pass for a native, and it just never happens. There have been a few rare individuals who, for whatever reason, are able to essentially pass in certain situations, but never because of something anyone trained them to do. They're just extreme outliers, and they're just kind of discovered that way. And there are a couple interesting stories about that. But in most cases, also, they're at kind of a 50% level, like not enough where you would send them in to actually spy because it's too dangerous.
Yeah, don't send me in for that. I could probably do it from like an intelligence standpoint, but not the language part.
Yeah. So it kind of reshuffles everything because a lot of people are focused on that. They want to sound exactly like a native speaker or pass for a native speaker, and it's understandable. But we are very realistic with our clients and try to make sure they understand that that's not a necessary goal. It's not something that happens, but it's not necessary either, because all of us know, I know hundreds, thousands of non-native speakers who are extremely effective communicators and more effective communicators than natives all the time. So being an effective communicator does not depend on sounding different.
Yeah, and I can even thinking back to, I know you teach phonetics, and thinking back to my phonetics course, and a lot of people know this, Dr. Stacy Raymer is one of my mentors and famous, for her work in aphasia and her research, but she was my phonetics professor as well. And so she's from Wisconsin originally. And so she would always say, I'm going to say this and it's not going to sound like how you all sound in coastal Virginia. So I need you to make sure that you're hearing it and interpreting it phonetically the way that I'm saying it, and not the way that you hear it based on your framework of speech and your dialect. So I think that's a really interesting point too, because it's so funny when we're in speech for graduate programs and doctoral programs, we hear all these things. I think maybe it's different. I don't have a PhD, so I can't really speak to the doctoral aspect, but I remember being in these courses and just trying to learn all the things and the knowledge and pathophysiology of swallowing and the neural basis of language. And, I'm learning all this and it makes absolutely no sense until you get into the field and you're really immersed in that. So I imagine it's sort of the same thing as learning a language and being practical in its use. because we
Yeah.
learn all these things and then it really doesn't translate very well until you need to use it, or you're kind of forced into the interpretation part of it. Would you say that's a good
Yeah, and
analogy?
I mean, I imagine, I think because really I've been an advocate for non-native speakers for my entire career, and I think one of the important things to realize is how challenging it can be to be in one of our graduate programs. They're extremely competitive. They're very rigorous programs. And so if you add on that element of, well, this isn't even my L1, right? There might be certain sounds I can't quite distinguish as easily as a native speaker, or there may be just phrases I don't know, colloquial language. So it's adding these extra elements. And I think in our field, we have to make sure that we're not creating additional obstacles for people, because we need as many non-native speakers in our field as possible. I mean, our field really needs these people. So it's really important to get that message out there, that we just have to be a little bit more open to what it's like to be a speaker of another language. And if your L1 is not English, we have to be very understanding about that.
Yeah, and this is not something we talked about prior to the podcast, and I hope and if you don't want to, you said you were up for it.
I'm open for any question you have.
So what if it's someone who has a speech disorder that's going into the graduate program? So say it's not, I would say stuttering is probably one we hear like a
Yeah.
dysphonic person the most, but what if it's someone with dysarthria?
Yeah, that's a hot topic and a big question. I think the connection between fluency and speech language pathology has been strong from the beginning of our profession. I mean, going back to Van Riper. So so we have many of the experts are they're stutterers. And so that has always been part of it. But I think, yeah, navigating this nowadays is complex to try to figure out at what level and in which areas can you support. With the certainly with the non-native speech, ASHA and everybody's been very clear about this, and it's really logical that since we need non-native speakers in the field because of the linguistic environment in the United States, we really need everybody who speaks all these different languages. There's an extreme shortage, that you don't have to be someone who sounds exactly like a native speaker, or even and you can even have some phonemes that may be challenging for you, and there are just workarounds for that. As long as I think we have some sort of clear standards, that obviously you would want SLPs would need to be intelligible, and I know that term we'll probably talk about a little bit today, and speak naturally and be proficient speakers of English, but there's no reason that they have to sound a certain way. We all sound so different around this country, right? You sound different than I sound, or somebody from Seattle is going to sound different. We all sound a little bit different. So we have to get that awareness out there to the world, really. There's a lot of misunderstandings and people will make judgments. There's a lot of linguistic discrimination that goes on when people don't sound the way you're expecting or different than the community that you interact with all the time.
Well, and a lot of times my understanding and kind of perception now that I've been in the field for a long time is that who better to understand what someone who has a speech sound disorder or really any communication challenge than someone else who has a similar or even an unrelated communication challenge. They're very well versed in not only the biases but the internal feelings that they have about their speech and their communication. So I think it's
and it applies to accent modification. I know we're going to be talking about that today, but people forget that there are non-native speakers who provide accent modification, who have non-native accents, and because it's I think a consumer issue, sometimes the public will not be as accepting of that. If they're working, they're going to look for a native speaker, and some of that's based on linguistic discrimination. But a lot of these non-natives who do accent modification will specialize in the language that is their L1. And that gives them so many insights because they really learned English, so they can guide other people who speak their language into how they produce the phonemes or different things that they know, comparing their two languages. So that's usually the way that works. But and we have, accent modification providers speak every dialect I've ever heard, and it goes around, it goes on around the world. It's not the kind of thing that's just for English and just people speaking standard American English or whatever you want to call that. That's a controversial idea too.
Yeah, that kind of, moves into the framework of what should we be looking at when working in accent modification?
Well, the framework, and I mentioned kind of briefly, but the effective communication, that's the most important thing. So I think and that doesn't go to native or non-native at all. I mean, everybody wants to be an effective communicator. That's that just goes without saying, really. It's part of communication, is that you want to be successful, you want to be effective, you want to share your ideas. So that's the main principle then. And then there's a lot of good work that went on from Derwing and Monroe, our two researchers from Canada, and they've done over 25 years of accent work. And what they did was they tried to separate out oral speech into some different areas. And it was very useful, because first they said there's something they're calling just accentedness, which is just what makes us sound different. Just like you sound different than I do, but we understand each other, but we sound different. So that's important, because you don't have to touch that at all. Why we didn't have to change the way we speak right now to each other. You sound different than I do, but we're not changing anything about how we communicate or anything like that. So that's the accentedness part. And then you get intelligibility, though, because intelligibility is key. You have to be understood. And if you're communicating and someone doesn't understand what you're saying, that's a miscommunication. So intelligibility is number one. That's the main thing we work on. And then there was a little bit of work on what they call comprehensibility, which is sort of ease of understanding. But in my work, I've gone into, I just call it naturalness, not like I invented that term, but that comes from our field. But naturalness, and I'm sure you've worked on that with your clients, if they're dysarthric or alaryngeal speech, or there are several areas, fluency, where naturalness is important. And I think that fits in better, that we don't touch the accent part. So even though it's called accent modification, we actually are not working on the accent. It's just a term. We could talk about that later, but we're setting that aside. Somebody sounds different. Great. That's beautiful. That's part of what makes the world interesting, but they have to be intelligible. Everybody agrees that you want to be intelligible. And again, it's going to be dependent. Just because I'm a native speaker of English, I may go over to Scotland and not be intelligible. And vice versa. So intelligibility is always at the heart of communication. And then we add the naturalness element. Just means there are times when you can understand someone perfectly, as far as you could just transcribe what they said, or you could write it down word for word, but it was challenging. It threw you off the way. It could have been really super slow, or it went up and down, the prosody, something distracted you essentially, because it was so far from the patterns that we usually do. And so I guess the last thing, because those are what we work on, the constructs. And then we do focus on the segmentals, which is the IPA chart basically, and then the suprasegmental. So that's a key part of what we do, is we also work at these features of connected speech, intonation, phrasing, rate, linking. Those are things that actually SLPs are not normally experts at, to be honest, because we're more comfortable in that segmental world, our TIC. But that's what we do a lot of. We do a lot at the suprasegmental level. So yeah, it's all about effective communication, leaving the accent aside and working on intelligibility and naturalness.
Yeah, and I think, you mentioned prosody, but I think one thing that I noticed, particularly when we started doing a lot of meetings and things like that with Zoom or other computer-based platforms, sometimes people that speak with a lower intensity, that was a little bit more of a challenge to hear, or if they had background noise, because Zoom at first was not real great at removing or reducing that background noise. And so that, I think, has really played into some of the things that we see as SLPs, or I get a lot when I was working in outpatient, I'd get a lot of wives who would say, I can hear him and I can understand him, but he mumbles, or we would get if he's not looking at me. And again, I think that speaks to a lot of just our communication styles, but I think it comes into play when people are coming in for referrals, and that's the primary, is that I can't hear them, or I can hear the tone, but I can't, like you said, comprehensibility. How are we able to not only understand what they said, but then also to comprehend and get every word without a change?
That's it. And that communication style, which is what I call it when we're talking about non-native speakers, because I mean, it's similar to pragmatics, but I just prefer the term communication styles. But that is also important, because people in their native language are going to interact differently. And a lot of that is part of someone's accent. And we have a little bit of a different approach, because in our field, we've made so much progress as far as really being accepting, understanding, cultural humility, understanding that that different cultures are equally valid, and we're just trying to be respectful. But in our world, in the accent world, we're often just trying to raise awareness. So we might say something to the client to say, are you aware that this is a little bit different the way that you answer a question? Maybe you pause for 10 seconds, which is not typical in our culture, and making sure they're aware. And if they're aware, then we're basically done with that, because that's their choice. And we're just trying to give options. But a lot of times our clients may say, oh, I had no idea that this is something different, the way you communicate. Even facial gestures, expressions, that's part of someone's accent. And just to build that awareness. Think about how people count on their fingers in different ways. You know, Korean is going to come in with the pinky and then come out, or, you know, they're different, I guess, thumb in and then go around. And there are different ways. I know I mentioned I'm in Europe a month out of the year, and in the country I go to, Hungary, this is a 1, that's a 2. So there are just different ways to count. And that's part of that awareness building, to make sure people know, because they could even have misunderstandings just with their hands.
Mm-hmm.
So, and as long as they're aware, and then that's part of what we do.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think we kind of take that nonverbal communication, and I say this again to my students a lot, is, you know, when you're back to teaching live now in the classroom, for the most part, I do teach in a virtual class as well, but you know, when you're dealing with the graduate students or the undergraduates, and you're live and you say something and they're kind of giving you these looks for this postural gesturing, and you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, well, when we're working with what we call intonation, which is really a subset of prosody, and there are different ways to define all of these terms, but this sort of pitch of any language, which is very different. And you'll find sometimes we'll get the clients who are using different patterns, or very, very flat compared to English. And we'll try to get that across to them, that this is going to really affect your message. But sometimes they're hesitant. We get hesitant clients who will say, well, you're just having fun, or you're acting, and this is the way I communicate in my own language. And we just want to build awareness, so if someone will have a choice. But a lot of times, yeah, that dynamic difference, you'll get some languages where it's a lot flatter, and people are going to misjudge the emotion or the importance of something. And then you get some that are overly dynamic compared to English. And so that people are going to sound very excited all the time. And they have studied this. So there are studies where they'll rate people's impressions of somebody's mood, for example, and they'll find mismatches a lot of times if it's non-native speakers.
So, you know, when you're thinking about the languages that are more, I guess, animated would be my word I would probably use. What are some of those languages, and like specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I do think of, and when I did in my ESL career, I did have in some summers, I would have classes that were half Italian and half Japanese, and that was quite a contrast, because for cultural many reasons. But the Italians, yeah, definitely had a much more dynamic pattern, versus my Japanese clients were very flat most of the time.
Okay.
And some of these cultural ideas too, I remember too, that I've had many Japanese students over the years, but when I first started having them, this is going over 20 years ago, but I really thought at first, I thought, well, they must hate this class. They're not enjoying this at all. And then I did a kind of a diary assignment at one point, and I would get these passages like, today was so much fun, I had the greatest time in class. I thought, okay, I get it, you know. So, and it took some time to develop, and now I'm very comfortable around various clients from various cultures. And sometimes we'll work with now I'm no longer, I think that it was a little bit out of date, the bio there, just because I did recently step down from our clinic here at San Diego State to focus on my state association work. But I would often train the graduate clinicians and tell them, you may have a different reaction. Let's say you have a Russian client. They may look like with very flat affect, essentially, right? If you're using more medical terminology, but they're not going to react to you. They're not going to smile as much. And they also may want you to be very direct with them, which is hard for Americans, because we're a very feel-good style of culture at the moment, right? So you want, oh, good job, you tried really hard, that's almost there. It's very positive, versus a lot of times our clients from different parts of the world will say, no, just tell me if it was terrible. So they would rather hear the much more black and white version of things.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a good, kind of place to start with. What's the best way for SLPs to kind of start working with accent modification? Because I think this is I know for me, I don't feel like I'm well versed, and I've seen a lot in the media in the past about, oh, you can come and work with our corporate clients to help them modify their accent. And I think it's like, I think what you're talking about is not the same as that. And it doesn't
No, exactly.
mesh.
Yeah. And really that is why I wrote my book, because I just thought, I've got this 26-year career in ESL, and that's really where I started. And then I've got a 20-year career as an SLP. But I felt like I have an idea about how both professions approach this, but a lot of people really don't, and they get excited about it. It sounds interesting to them, but they don't really know where to start. So that is really why I wrote the book, because I wanted it to be, this is just for SLPs if they're interested in this, how to get started in it. But I would say just some of the major tips I usually have are, well, definitely brush up on your phonetics, make sure, because phonetics, that is important. So you need to fill in some gaps on that too, because going back to the vowels are not really something that we deal with a lot as SLPs, and you probably had it last as an undergrad in phonetics, but we do that a lot with the clients. The super segmentals I mentioned to you, because people are not as familiar with that. How does linking work in English? What about intonation, phrasing, phrasal stress? Those are things we just, our native speakers, we just absorb it. And even the grammar sometimes, because I know when I started my ESL career, I just assumed like everybody would. You just think, oh, I'm a proficient speaker of English, so it's no problem. I know all the rules of English, but you don't. You don't know how to explain things to people, because of course you could say things the way everyone does in your language. But if someone says, well, why is it this and not that? It's pretty easy to get stuck. So those are helpful. And then I think just getting involved in our community, we have, and there are other options. There are some trainings that people can do, and there are a lot of good ones where you could spend some money and get some training and use their products. But there are a lot of entry level ways to get started that don't cost anything. There's a Facebook group called SLPs and Accent Modification, and I don't know, we might even have in the crowd today a couple of people from there. I hope. It's a very big group, almost 4,000 people in there. Paula Gallet runs it, and that's a great place for people to just get interested, because it's all SLPs and students who want to do it. And then I guess last I would say CourseBand, which I'm currently co-president of. That is also a great place, because a lot of people in there are doing accent modification along with presentation skills and voice training. But yeah, I would say just get in there and do it too. It doesn't take, you don't even need my book. I mean, you really could just get it started by figuring it out on your own. That's the way I approach it. I think DIY works really well for this. If you are committed to it and you want to train yourself and get some practice, you can do this.
Are you taking advantage of our new amazing feature? The Certificate Tracker. The free CE Tracker allows you to keep track of all of your CEUs, whether they are earned with us at speechtherapypd.com or through another provider. Simply upload your certificate to your registered account and you're all set. So come join the fastest growing CE provider, speechtherapypd.com.
Yeah, I get what you're saying too, because I teach technical writing for undergraduates, and trying to get them to understand that when we go into the profession, how you're going to present your ideas in a technical manner to physicians or to school administrators or to other professionals that you need to refer to is very different than what we're taught in our English-based school. We're taught creative writing for the most part. A lot of literature analysis and a lot of essays that may be more political or, current event type stuff. And it's not technical writing. It's difficult for the students. A lot of times the grammar part is also part of what I teach. And I find that as the longer I teach this course, the less the students are learning at the elementary level. And one of the sections that we cover are pronouns. And so it was interesting to me this 2 semesters ago, I had a couple of students who thought when I said pronouns that we were going to be talking about pronouns in relation to gender identification. Yeah. And they weren't understanding that we were going to be talking about it in relation to language discourse and analysis. And so that was kind of eye-opening, because we're sort of seeing this whole difference, I think, of what I learned versus what my in-laws and my parents learned and my kids learned in school. And it makes it a little bit of a challenge when you're looking at how we teach things to the next generation.
That's it. And I mean, accent's also a special area in the sense that you actually don't need any specialized training. You should get all that, but I mean, it really can be done by anyone, and you don't need to have your license to do it. And you really just have to be proficient in the language, native or non-native. You just have to be proficient. It goes on around the world. So really the number one provider, it's not the SLPs. We're not even close, because the number one provider, apart from the lay public, right? Because people are making adjustments to people they're interacting with all the time. That's a form of accent modification. But there are, mostly it's language teachers. When you learn a new language, you're learning, okay, here's how you pronounce, this is a certain sound we have in this language, that kind of thing. It's mostly language teachers, but voice trainers do it, dialect coaches.
Yeah.
But anyone can do it. So SLPs, I just think, are the best. And my ESL friends are very, very good. And there are some that are absolutely top notch. But SLPs kind of come in there. We're communication experts. This is natural for us. We have just the instincts and the training. We're ready to go. I think it's just filling in those gaps, because there are a couple things you do want to brush up on. The vowels and the suprasegmentals are the main ones.
Yeah. Oh, vowels. Oh.
Yeah, people don't really like that, but that's one of the things that, because we're so focused as SLPs, we're really focused on that accuracy piece with the consonants. That's what we're trained for with the kids, and we've got it. We do that too. It's just that we have a different subset, right? So we're not going to work on, for example, an S. We're never going to work on an S, because really everybody has an S. There are some languages where they don't have a Z, like Swedish and Spanish. Of course, Spanish is the big player on that one, but we will work on a different subset of consonants. But when we get to the vowels, English has a lot more vowels than most languages, and that's what's causing these problems when it's seat, sit, leave, live. I leave now, I leave here now. Oh, you're leaving right now, you have to go somewhere. No, I leave here. I live here. Okay, you live here. So this causes that is one of the major, I mean, there are over 300 minimal pairs for that. So it causes miscommunication all day long for the speakers of languages that have 5 vowels in there and they don't have an I.
Throw in a schwa.
The schwa is a huge thing, because schwa is massive, because first of all, that whole central vowel space is missing for most of our clients' languages. That's just usually just blank. And then the idea of reduction, because we're not saying, photo, photographer, photographic, right? No, we're saying photo and then photographic, photo, and photographer. Look at that first vowel in photographer. It's nothing. You don't even have to have a vowel. You could go straight from the F to the T, photographer, right? So that's the kind of thing that a lot of languages don't do. They are going to say photographer. So that's a change for them, these languages that don't have reductions.
Yeah, that just blows my mind a little bit.
Yeah, and the suprasegmentals, because we don't think about that. There are a lot of things going on there. The intonation patterns that we use, an example of that would be with what we call the tag questions or question tags, and you say, you've done this before, haven't you? Or you've done this before, haven't you? It's a pretty big difference, right? Because one is confirming it, and you don't need to answer. I'm just assuming it. And the other one, I really want to know, actually. So you should tell me. And that's all done by pitch.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, when we're thinking about, and this is something that we kind of talked about beforehand, just linguistic discrimination and the way it's connected to accents and accent reduction, I think is a really kind of hot button topic right now. And again, a lot of that is about perception of what people think accent modification is and what it is not.
Absolutely. I think this has been a hot topic. It's been around for a while. And I think we in the accent community are always trying to raise awareness of linguistic discrimination. I think there have been some critics in the last couple of years who've really put us on the other side, essentially saying that you're making things worse in that area. And we view it completely differently, that we're really all on the same side, that we're trying to combat this linguistic discrimination. And it's horrendous. There are a lot of horror stories. We get them directly from the clients, and we also get them from the research, but it's also universal. People should remember that. This is not something, because that confuses people. I think people in our society, there's a lot going on, and we want to be really do the right thing always. But once it's focused on English, a lot of other things come up, versus if you see this is a terrible thing that goes on around the world. People who don't come from the capital of the country are very often, that's just a generalization, but in many countries, it's the capital dialect, whatever that is. And if you don't speak that dialect, you're going to be discriminated against. So yeah, it's a part of somebody's identity. I know with my wife, who I mentioned is a non-native speaker, just talking to her when we had our son, how we just decided, how are we going to raise him? And she just said, she's extremely proficient. She's an SLP. And she just said, there's always a little bit of a mask when I'm speaking English, even if I'm proficient. It's just one layer of separation from what I view as my true self. So there are issues with that. And we were talking about creating these in-groups, out-groups. It can affect employment, relationships, housing. it's really bad. And there's even reverse linguistic discrimination where people will hear an accent. If you tell them there's an accent, they'll hear it, even if it's not there. So yeah, there's been a lot of that out there. It goes on in our field. It goes on in the world. And then I think our field in the SLP world, accent has been stigmatized for a long time. I've heard stories for a long time of just some things people are suspicious of, or they think there's something wrong about it. I'm not really sure why. But then it really started to come to a boil there around 2020, and there were some sort of high profile talks that were really making the case that we shouldn't be doing this as a profession. And those of us in the field, I think, were very surprised, because if you look at it in more of a disconnected way, it's phonological instruction. And how could you say you're going to learn a language, but you can't be instructed in the phonology of it, or that's a bad thing to instruct someone? You know, when I wanted to learn, well, I mean, when I had learned Spanish, I mentioned to you, I learned Spanish in Chile, but when I became an SLP, I actually hired somebody and said, hey, I'm going to be working with kids, and this is the test I'm going to be giving, and I'm going to read it to you, and can you give me some tips and make sure that you can understand me and all that. I wanted to be intelligible to my clients and speak naturally. It's a natural part. When you're learning a language, you want to learn the phonology. So I think there's definitely something that surprised us, that there was so much criticism about this thing that's basically normal. I mean, you're learning a language, you're going to learn the phonology, but it got so tied up into a lot of sort of political, social issues that were going on in the US at the time. It's much calmer now. And I've given a lot of talks in public, and really, I'm just open. I try to be very balanced about different opinions people may have about this, but no one ever really says anything directly. And I've been in some kind of heated things in when it was getting a little bit contentious. All I could do is stand up and say what I'm telling you now, the same kinds of things. These are just normal things. It's just phonological instruction. So I never really worried, even if it got a little intense sometimes. But now it's gotten calmer. It's gotten calmer.
Yeah, and I think one of the scenarios we kind of talked about was just one of my experiences, and other people that I knew when we were coming up in the graduate school. The way that we were told we needed to sound wasn't necessarily a phonological representation. It was more of I'm going to modify your dialect, which is, again, I think, a myth about what accent modification looks like versus what it was portrayed as. When I was coming up in school, it was like, I need to fix you because you don't sound the way I want you to sound.
That's it. Yeah,
But
I think there was that understanding, or that was the misconception in our minds, because I think a lot of us thought, well, have you seen an accent modification session? Because it's not like that. It's not the level that maybe they were imagining, where you're really like, well, you sound exactly like everybody in the United States, but not from this town in Iowa. We want you to get right to that. It's not like that at all. In most cases, you are literally doing leave, live. You know, it's major differences where someone is not being understood because they're not able to distinguish two very common vowels. So mostly we are working on intelligibility and naturalness, but we're never at the point like, oh, I totally understood you, it sounded natural, but it's got to be a little more, just so it could be just from Kansas. I've never seen it happen. Yeah. And sometimes you'll get clients, though, this is important to point out, because we mentioned that what we call ultimate attainment, nobody really is going to come out of accent modification and pass for a native. But what will happen is some clients will want that. And it's understandable. We know from research that it's at least 95% of clients. And there's a logic to it, right? I mean, if someone gave you a choice and said, you can learn Chinese, I'm going to give you two choices. You could have one version where you walk around in Beijing and you call somebody and they never hear, they think you were born in Beijing, or you learn the other version where they're always going to know that you came from another country. Well, most people, to be honest, would want that other one and want to sound exactly right. So we understand the motivation, but we also know it's not important. It doesn't have to happen. And we counsel our clients to tell them that's not what this is about. So I think there are some clients who will come in and we have to have long talks with them about it, that this is not what we do. It's not important. And we usually discourage those clients.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've had quite a few people that, just in my personal life, who parents were immigrants from a variety of countries, from Russia to Vietnam to Cuba, that their parents, when they came here, decided that they wanted their children to assimilate to being American, and they did not teach them the native language.
Yeah.
They cannot speak as, first generation, essentially, they cannot speak their heritage language because they weren't taught it when they were kids, and they haven't necessarily pursued it as adults. So that's kind of interesting too, because this whole thought process of, there's a comedian, I can't recall his name off the top of my head, but he's in Texas, and I think his parents were Chinese immigrants, and he sounds like he's from Texas. He has
Yeah,
no
of course, right? Yeah.
accent like his parents do. And when he first became a stand-up comic, people made fun of that. And so I think you get the flip on both sides of, like, you look a certain way, we think you're supposed to sound a certain way, and all these other biases that sort of come along with that. And most recently, I got a consult for a client who is classified as an adult, as he's got a couple psych diagnoses, but R is part of his main diagnosis from, birth. And he speaks a pretty particular African American dialect in a rural part of our state in Virginia. And I got a consult for him because they kept saying that he has these features that they didn't know were African American dialect, but I knew as soon as I heard him talk, that's what it was. And they wanted me to, they said, fix it.
Oh, yeah.
Fix
there are
it.
still horror stories out there. We do get horror stories, but I think I've seen really just in the last, it seems like, again, my son's 15, but certainly within 20 years or more than that, there has been such a shift in that area, because I think going back to stories that you and I know from maybe a while back, where parents would say, I really want my kids to fit in, so I don't want to teach them our heritage language, which is just so sad for me on a personal level. To now, when I know with my son, having him in the park, and people would hear that we're speaking a different language, and they would come up and say, how we really want our son to speak another language. What do you recommend? How are we? And they had no connection. They didn't have anyone in their family who spoke another language, but they just wanted it for their kids. So it's shifted really 180 degrees, that everyone realizes how desirable it is to be multilingual and bilingual. It's shifted in our culture massively.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so sad, some of these misunderstandings that parents worry, and especially if their kids do have a language delay, sometimes they'll be counseled to, maybe if you focus on one language, which is not there. And it breaks my heart. And we always really just want to focus on what are the languages that are important for you and your family situation, and for your child, for culture, whatever it is. That's what you should be doing, whatever the important ones are. I hear stories, with my kids, I work a lot with with adolescents. I'm at a high school setting right at the border. We're literally right at the border to Mexico. But I mean, sometimes you'll have some students who are not that, their communication skills with their own parents or grandparents start to diminish, because they start their Spanish, there's some attrition there, and their parents, and they actually are not that good at communicating with their own family. And it just breaks my heart.
Yeah, I feel like that too. And I know the one person in particular, that was, her mom is Vietnamese, and she didn't teach the kids the language because she wanted them to be American.
Yeah.
But then she had a lot of family who has since moved here, and they are fluent in Vietnamese. And so she, has felt very left out of that whole culture and that whole process of their family gatherings, because they're speaking Vietnamese, and she's sort of on the outskirts and doesn't understand their language. And so you kind of, again, I think that's just sort of this misnomer of what the general public thinks, and even the SLP world thinks accent modification looks like versus what it actually is. So
yeah, it's very different. It's very different. I mean, some of the sessions, if you watched one of the sessions, some parts would look familiar, some of the artic. We do a lot of minimal pairs, but it's a little different than doing it with the kids with pictures. We just do the words, but some of that would look familiar. But a lot of these things with the super segmentals or some of the other work we do would look very different, role plays, that kind of thing that we do. There's connections. SLPs would be at home with it right away, but it wouldn't look like a lot of the things you normally do.
Well, it almost too, I think there's probably a lot of correlation. And if I'm way off topic or way off base, please tell me that I am. But people who work with transgender clients, I think too, kind of see the same thing. The things that they're addressing or working on tend to be more like the super segmentals, and some of the way that pitch and intonation is impactful for their speech patterns.
Yeah, and we have a connection there, because those are both mentioned in ASHA in the scope of practice, and it talks about accent modification. It talks about gender affirming voice training, that type of thing. I don't remember the term that ASHA actually used at the time they wrote that, but the basic idea. And so we do see some similarities there. I think it's different though, because there are some other areas that make it much more nuanced because it could be approached with gender dysphoria. So it could be considered a disability in some cases or not. So it's complicated. So we don't normally just say, hey, we're exactly like that. I think there are enough significant differences. But what we think is similar is just this idea of respecting the client. If the client comes, if I had a client come to me and saying, I want to sound more feminine, I can't imagine saying, well, no, you shouldn't, just sound the way you are and be good with that. But essentially that's what they're telling us to do with these accent clients, because the accent clients come to us and say, I want to be more effective. I want to make sure that my coworkers understand me. I'm not going to stand up and say, no, you're wrong. They should just be better listeners and it's all society's fault and all that. I mean, I'm simplifying. I want to make sure I'm being fair, but we're trying to respect the clients that this is what they want to do. And again, we're going to counsel them if they're looking for something we can't provide. If they come in and say, I'm sick of people asking me where I'm from. I want to walk into a room and nobody knows I wasn't born in the US. And that's when we are going to counsel them that that's not going to happen. But other than that, we're going to respect whatever their goals are.
Yeah, and I like that you said the counseling piece, because I think, again, that's important, that this is more of a client-centered or patient-centered thing than it is us trying to change how someone else sounds based on our own biases and perceptions. It's someone seeking you out because they feel like they have a need to make this change that they view as a positive thing for them.
Right. And I think an example we use a lot of times is again, I mentioned with the awareness that we just want to make sure that awareness is there. So you might get a client, the example I use is maybe the client says, I'm from Mexico. And they say it with the velar fricative, right, instead of Mexico. And I think our idea is to make sure they're aware. Okay, this is how it's normally said in English, and explain, and then give them the choice. Do you prefer to say it the way that you would say it in your native language? Great, that's good. But then you get a client sometimes who might say, I'm from Brazil. And you say, okay, actually, it's more like an L at the end, Brazil. Oh, an L? Like they're not even aware sometimes, because their languages work so differently. Brazilian Portuguese doesn't have those final L's. They're going to labialize that. And so you have clients where they'll say, oh, it's like an L, I get it. And they want it to sound a little more that way. So we just want to give that choice, that awareness. We're not telling people you have to sound this way. You can only say your country this way or whatever it is. No, it's always about the choice.
Yeah. And I think that the ethics behind that is another really good point, because again, I think people have this perception of, I don't know, we've had so much controversy, I think, in the field the last couple of years about what people think about our governing body versus not, and all these other practice realms of you can't be a generalist, you need to be a specialist, or vice versa. The people who say, well, you're a specialist, you can't be a generalist. And it gets kind of muddy and really detracts, I think, from what we do.
I think so. And I think what bothers me too is that it is very divisive sometimes. And I think it really came in almost like really trying to socially pressure people. This is something we think is bad, so everybody should think it's bad. But why? Well, I'm not really even willing to talk about it. It's much more just we're going to pressure everybody. That's how it appeared to us. And versus like, let's get out there and have a forum and we'll talk about it, and we'll talk about best practice, and we'll hear your ideas and we'll compare and all that. So I think that it's calmed down, as I said. And if people are curious to find out more information about like the linguistic discrimination part or any aspect, the practice portal was updated for ASHA a couple years ago, I think about 2 years ago, for accent modification. So if you just Google accent modification ASHA practice portal, it's very good. And they have a lengthy discussion about linguistic discrimination that I think is very balanced. So it's just that idea. Let's interact. Let's figure out how to work together and respect each other. I do talk in my talks a lot about the principle of charity, that we're not saying that the people who are critical of accent modification are doing it because they're bad people or something like that. And we hope they don't assume that about us. It's really this idea of like, we're all in it to help people make the world a better place, successful communication, all of that. And they have a view that we're moving in the wrong direction with what we do. And we have a view that this is actually helping people communicate more effectively. And we're also raising awareness of linguistic discrimination and supporting our clients. So I think it's that idea of just, we all are coming at it from a good place, and we just have to work together and really respect a little more freedom of choice, though, that, hey, maybe this isn't something I want to do, but I'm not going to really just try to undermine it constantly, because we do feel that. And there's not many practices that we do that are like a whole area where somebody thinks that the whole thing is bad and shouldn't happen. It's hard. For example, with swallowing, right? You might think, I don't know if there are many people who think this, but they're maybe in the old days, right? But you might think, hey, this isn't something SLP should do. That should be nurses or doctors or whatever, right? But you're not saying don't do any swallowing, right? And the same thing, that's the way we feel about this. Like, if you really feel it's just SLPs who shouldn't do this, I mean, it's going to go on, right? People are learning languages. You can't, why would you stop that? You're not going to say, okay, we're going to, here it is, new language class, you're learning French, whatever it is, Korean, and we're just going to teach you the syntax and the semantics, but no phonology, because we don't believe. So of course not. It's part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, that I think when you put it in those terms too, it is more digestible and easier for people to understand because again, I think we get hung up on this whole like everyone's supposed to sound American or whatever, and that's
Yeah,
not
and
what
some of these
like.
horrible things that have gone on, and some of these linguistic hierarchies that are out there, people are going to discriminate based on the way someone sounds. A lot of that's horrendous, right? And we have stigmatized dialects, and that stuff's all bad. But that's the part that everybody agrees. I would hope, and we can all work together to get that message out there, but also respect that different clients are going to want to approach this in different ways. And, we can work with society as a whole and try to raise awareness, but we also have individual clients. I mean, these two things can happen at the same time. You can have linguistic discrimination sometimes that's completely unfair, that the person is intelligible, natural, and somebody just is xenophobic. That can happen, but in that same world, you also have people that are learning a new language and are not intelligible. If I went out to learn Chinese tomorrow, I guarantee you, right, those first couple of weeks are going to be tough for my listeners. That's going to be hard.
I know it'd be hard for me.
Not just weeks. I mean, it could take forever. So I think we have to understand that both these things can happen at the same time. You can have horrible linguistic discrimination, various levels of it, but you also are acquiring a new language and you're going to have to learn. You're not going to right away be proficient in a language unless you get some training or work really hard on your own. But usually you have someone helping.
Yeah, and it kind of brings me back to thinking about, when I lived in Iceland, and that was a language that was completely phonology wise completely different from English, and it was beautiful to listen to, but I will tell you there was probably like two things I could say, and that was hello and goodbye, because everything else it was so challenging. The patterns, their prosody was different, the intonation was different, just the whole thing was very challenging. And we had a neighbor who did like a whole immersive thing while he was there, and he got pretty good at Icelandic. But I worked in an office where my boss was Icelandic, and he would say stuff and I'd be like,
Yeah, yeah.
So it does. There's a lot to the phonological aspect of learning a language that I think the whole point of all of this to me is that is the culmination of why someone would do accent modification as a professional, is to teach that part. If nothing else, that's probably one of the harder aspects for people to learn who are non-native speakers.
Yeah, and we sort of attract, I mean, the community it's a lot of interesting people, and people are they love the clients. That's almost always, and in my book, when I ask people, why did you get into this? I mean, everybody says the clients because they love working with these clients. And also it's a different group of people. It's just a different area. Sometimes people like just a slightly different side of things. You're working with a population where it is just a language difference that you're talking about. And some people want a little break and to do some of that. So it's just, we should all respect a little bit that, just like we added again swallowing to our field, and there are other things that we can do because of our background, and to stand in the way of that doesn't quite make sense to me. And if there are certain practices that go on, because that happens in all aspects of our field, we have to police that and monitor that. We've got to work on best practices, and some of these things are not ethical in any part of our field. You're going to find some practitioners that are not doing things the right way, but to really criticize the whole practice of basically phonological instruction seems like a real big overreach. And when we ask, because it also does tend to be a little generational, when I meet younger SLPs or grad students, they have this idea that it's problematic or there's something wrong with it, but they can't quite put their finger on it because it's really more just a social pressure campaign in a sense. Like this is just something that's icky, but we don't understand it. Our clients don't really understand it. And so I think just getting that awareness out there and really working together, respecting that we're going to have different approaches to things, and we all want the world to be a better place with less discrimination and more options for our non-native clients.
Yeah. Well, and one thing before I get to the questions is that what I think a lot of people too don't understand is when they look at the practice portal on any of the subjects that are covered, a lot of what we see are the meta-analysis and these really long-term studies of what the best practice actually is. And so I'm like you, I find the practice portal to be extremely helpful and to provide information that I wouldn't have the time to glean through all of that on my own. So I'm like you, I'm a big proponent of looking at the practice portal and seeing what those documents look like. Because
Yeah, and
it is
I was
helpful.
honored to be a subject matter expert, and ASHA reached out and said, "Would you like to be part of this project?" And I wanted to get involved, and some of my friends got involved in it, and it was great to see because I wasn't sure where they were going to go. It was during a tough time when we were facing a lot of criticism, and I think if you look at it, you're going to see that it's very balanced. It really addresses a lot of what we do. So we're happy with that.
So let's get to some of the questions. Let me back up here.
I did catch just a couple things. I was trying not to get too distracted, but someone was asking for the spelling of Derwing and Monroe. So that's DERWING, and then Monroe is MUNRO, and they have a lot of stuff out there. Some very interesting. It's the ESL world. Yeah, someone put it in, or did you do it? Okay,
I
saw
did.
it. Okay, good.
Well, actually, I'll put it to host and panelists. Let me put that to everybody.
Okay. There it is. And I thought I caught another question. I saw that one. Someone mentioned Inglorious Bastard, so I caught that. That was funny. Group you mentioned. Okay, group you mentioned. Yeah. So there's something called CORSPAN, which is CORSPAN. So Corporate Speech Pathology Network, CORSPAN.org. And yeah, I got, it's funny because I'm not a private practitioner, so I'm a little bit unlikely to be involved in the leadership there, but I met them through my book and was very impressed and have some really good friends that I've made through that, some close friends already. And so I just loved their community and I got involved and I became president. And then we had a resignation. So I stepped back in with my co-president. We stepped back in to help out, but that's a great place. And then, Paula Gallet, that SLPs and accent modification, it's just wonderful because you just have to answer a couple of quick questions and you'll get on there, and just a nice little community of SLPs and students who are doing accent. So that's SLPs in accent modification Facebook group.
Yeah. I'm just typing it all in the chat.
So I'm not a private practitioner, and I think we didn't really talk about that much, but people may have questions about how do you get started with all that stuff. And I'm not the expert on that, but that's where you want to go, I think, to either CORSPAN or the SLPs and accent modification, or one of these. There are a lot of SLPs who've created programs that you can pay for training, and they have materials and they'll coach you on the best practices for private practice. I've never done that, to be honest. And I don't know if I'm brave enough. I think it does take some courage to be a private practitioner. I'm always very envious and respectful.
Yeah, I thought about doing private practice when I left the health system, and then I became, was already so exhausted that seemed very overwhelming. But I, like you, there are a lot of people who are very well versed and have these really great programs set up that they help train you in, and really truly want people to be successful at it. It's not like they're just trying to make money. And the one thing I would say about Facebook groups, I think they can be great, but I think you also have to still do your due diligence to make sure that the information that's put out there is evidence-based and isn't just anecdotal evidence, because we do see that quite a bit.
Yeah, there's some of that goes on, but people are pretty good. And really, for me, it's more like I announce, I put this in there somewhere that we're having a podcast tonight. So that kind of thing. We'll keep each other informed about it. We often meet at ASHA. If anybody's going to be at ASHA this year, I mentioned I'm giving a talk on accent on Friday, and we've been having accent happy hours at ASHA every year. We had a couple years off during COVID, but we get together usually on Friday, and we just all the accent people get together and talk.
What time is your talk on Friday?
I can't remember. Friday, I'll have to check, but sometime on Friday, and then probably after that we'll do the happy hour.
Yeah, mine's
you've got a couple of talks too, right?
I've just got the one, and it's on Friday, but it's at 5:00. So
okay, well, come on over right after.
Yeah, I should do that. I'll keep an eye out for it for sure, because I think that would be really fun. But Bob, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. I feel like I learned a lot, and it definitely filled in some gaps for me in what I thought accent modification was. So I really appreciate you coming on as a guest, and hopefully maybe we can do a talk together in the future as well.
Yeah, and let's get together for happy hour there in Seattle. But I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be invited, and thank you so much. This was great.
Yeah, for sure. And again, Bob, thank you, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening. If you have indicated that you are part of the ASHA registry and entered both your ASHA number and a complete address in your account profile prior to the course completion, we will submit earned CEUs to ASHA. Please allow 1 to 2 months from the completion date for your CEUs to be reflected on your ASHA transcript. Each episode comes with an accompanying course on speechtherapypd.com, available for a 0.1 ASHA CEU. And just for our listeners, get $20 off any subscription with promo code BRAINSTORMS20. SpeechTherapyPD.com is run by SLPs for SLPs. We've got the largest library of ASHA CEU eligible courses out there, adding fresh content every week. Remember, use BRAINSTORMS20 to get $20 off access to over 1,000 courses for an entire year. Head over to SpeechTherapyPD.com for more information and start earning CEs today. Thanks for tuning in to Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs. And don't forget, SpeechTherapyPD.com is your go-to for all things ASHA CEUs. Your positive reviews and support mean the world to us. We'd love for you to drop us a quick review and hit that follow button.